Welcome to another episode of Shadows of the Tarot. Elise carefully lifted her tarot cards from the antique box, placing them on the lounge room table. The tin that held them had grown tarnished with age, its once polished surface dulled. Determined to restore its luster, she reached for a cloth and some brass cleaner, rubbing in slow, deliberate circles. The faint scent of polish filled the air as she worked, momentarily lost in the rhythmic motion. A sudden knock at the door broke her concentration. She set the tin aside and made her way to answer, her pulse quickening slightly as she turned the handle. Standing on the doorstep was Detective Eddie, his expression unreadable yet intent. He greeted her politely before getting straight to the point, asking if she would mind him coming in for a few questions. Elise hesitated only for a second before stepping aside, allowing him entry. Once inside, Eddie wasted no time explaining his visit. Another tarot card had been found on a murder victim, and the chilling pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. He asked if she recalled a woman named Monica and whether she could provide any useful information. Elise nodded, her brow furrowing as she thought back. Monica had come for a reading several months ago, but beyond that, she was merely another client, another seeker looking for guidance. There was no deeper connection, no lingering ties. As they spoke, Eddie's gaze drifted around the room, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of an investigator. His attention finally landed on the tarot deck spread out on the table. Something about them struck a chord of recognition. The design, eerily familiar. Elise followed his gaze and, sensing his unease, quickly reassured him. "They're just cards," she said, her voice calm but firm. Eddie exhaled slowly, his expression tightening. "I know that," he admitted, "but the links between these cards and the victims are piling up." His instincts told him there was more at play here, something beneath the surface, just out of reach. He was certain that Elise, or at the very least her tarot deck, was connected to the string of unexplained deaths. But without tangible proof, he had no choice but to let it go for now. His eyes fell once more to the deck, lingering on the topmost card. The Moon. A card of mysteries and shadows, it spoke of hidden truths, instincts, and illusions. It urged one to trust intuition, to navigate fear and uncertainty. But its darker meanings loomed just as strongly: delusions, hallucinations, madness. Warnings of the unknown. That image of the moon would haunt him long after he left Elise's house. Without another word, Eddie took his leave, his mind already sifting through the threads of this growing mystery. Back at the station, he would follow up on leads, but the nagging feeling remained, like a whisper in the dark, that he was missing something. Something crucial. And if he didn't find it soon, more lives would be lost. Eddie barely had time to settle into his chair at the station when one of the officers burst into his office, his face flushed with urgency. "Detective, you're not going to believe this," the officer said, his voice tight with excitement. He dropped a thick file onto Eddie's desk, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Eddie arched a brow. "What is it?" The officer took a breath, then leaned forward. "I know you've been questioning Elise about Monica's case, but we just got a forensic update on Tammy's death. And you're going to want to hear this." He hesitated for a brief second before continuing. "Tammy didn't fall. It wasn't an accident." His voice dropped lower, weighted with certainty. "She was pushed." Eddie sat up straighter, his fingers tightening around the edges of the file. The words settled over him like a heavy fog. He had suspected as much, but now, forensics had confirmed it, by the position of the body. "This is now a homicide investigation," the officer added. "No question about it." A slow exhale escaped Eddie's lips. This was the break he had been waiting for. The officer straightened. "Want me to follow up on the lead?" Eddie shook his head, already reaching for his coat. "No. I've got this one." This was personal now. Within minutes, he was back at Elise's doorstep. The wooden panels of the house creaked slightly in the breeze, the scent of burning incense lingering in the air. When she opened the door, Her expression flickered from surprise to mild annoyance. "Detective," she said, crossing her arms. "Didn't we just do this a few days ago?" Eddie didn't waste time with pleasantries. His tone was firm, unwavering. "I need to ask you again, what really happened to Tammy?" Elise sighed, shaking her head. "Why do you keep harassing me?" she demanded. "I already told you, it was an accident." "Not anymore," Eddie countered. He studied her reaction as he continued, his voice low and deliberate. "Forensics confirmed that Tammy was murdered. She didn't fall. She was pushed." Elise's expression didn't waver, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable. "And that's not all," Eddie went on, his voice gaining an edge. "I saw a social thread about Carol's death." Elise frowned. "Carol?" "Yes," Eddie said, nodding. "Another name connected to these tarot cards. And the pattern keeps growing." He let the words hang in the air, waiting to see if she would react. Elise sighed, rubbing her temple. "I never gave Carol a reading." Eddie held her gaze, then reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Maybe not," he said, unlocking the screen. But a picture of a tarot card was found on hers. Elise's breath hitched, so subtle that most wouldn't have noticed. But Eddie did. Something was wrong. The shadows surrounding these deaths were thickening, and Elise was at the center of them. He just had to prove it. At first, Elise couldn't understand how this had happened, how a tarot card had ended up in Carol's possession. But then, a sickening realization struck her. There was one time. A day when she had asked Carol to wait for her inside her apartment. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. Could she have unwittingly sealed her friend's fate? The thought made her feel ill. She swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. But no, there was no way Carol's death could be connected to her. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. She met Eddie's gaze, forcing herself to remain composed. "Detective, I swear to you, I never gave Carol a reading. I have no idea how she got that card." Eddie studied her, his silence stretching between them like a tightening noose. Then, finally, he spoke. "Would you mind coming down to the station for further questioning?" Elise hesitated. This was it. He wasn't going to let it go. She offered a tight smile, masking the storm inside her. "Of course. I just need to grab my jacket." She turned away, her mind racing. What do I do? The cards, they were the key. She knew she had to protect them. But now, Eddie was too close. Too persistent. Unless she stopped him. Composing herself, she returned, jacket in hand, her expression unreadable. "Actually, detective, before we go, I might have some information about the cards that you'd find useful," she said, her voice even. "But I'd feel more comfortable talking here first. If you don't mind, I'll make some tea, and we can sit and discuss things properly." Eddie frowned, considering. "I promise," Elise added, offering just the right amount of sincerity. "After this, I'll come with you to the station. But there are some things I need to tell you off the record first." It was the perfect bait. After a moment, Eddie nodded. "All right. But make it quick." Elise moved to the kitchen, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. She reached for the tea canister, her fingers brushing against the small vial tucked away behind it. Carefully, she tipped a measured dose of the sedative into Eddie's cup, then added an extra swirl of honey to mask the bitterness. As she stirred, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. By the time he realized what was happening, it would already be too late. As they sat at the kitchen table, Elise leaned forward slightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Her voice was soft, measured, almost hypnotic as she began to speak. "Tammy was the one who found the deck," she admitted, her tone devoid of emotion. "She bought it from an antique dealer, an old man who claimed it was special. At first, she thought it was just a gimmick. But then, things started happening." Eddie's posture eased, his shoulders slackening as he listened. The warmth of the tea, the rhythmic cadence of Elise's words, it all lulled him into a strange, dreamlike state. She continued, her voice weaving a careful web around him. I didn't realize the truth about the deck until it was too late. It's not just ink on cardstock, detective. It's something else entirely. It knows things. And once it chooses you, it doesn't let go. Eddie blinked sluggishly, his grip on reality slipping. His eyelids grew heavier with each word, the room tilting slightly as drowsiness took hold. Elise watched as his chin dipped toward his chest, his breath slowing. Eventually, her voice trailed off. He was asleep, slumped over the table, completely unaware of what was coming next. Elise stood, her movements careful and deliberate. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, feeling the slow, steady pulse beneath his skin. He was deeply under. She exhaled. Now came the difficult part. She hadn't planned for this, not entirely. How was she supposed to get rid of a detective's body? The risk was monumental. Her pulse quickened, panic clawing at the edges of her mind, until a strange sensation washed over her. A vision. A woman, draped in colorful shawls, standing at a wooden counter. The sharp gleam of a meat cleaver in her hand. The rhythmic thud of blade meeting flesh. The scent of iron in the air. Elise inhaled sharply, the image lingering in her mind like a whisper of fate. She knew what she had to do. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and dialed a number. "Hey," she said, her voice controlled, casual. "Would you mind if I borrowed your reciprocating saw? I've been meaning to build a cupboard out of some pallets I found." There was a pause before her friend chuckled. "A saw? That's really out of character for you, Elise." She forced a light laugh. "Yeah, well, I thought it was time to get creative." "Sure," he said. "Come pick it up." Hanging up, Elise grabbed her keys and headed out. By the time she returned, saw in hand, Eddie hadn't moved an inch. Perfect. Elise spread a massive sheet of plastic across the floor near the dining table, smoothing out the wrinkles with steady hands. The sound of it crinkling beneath her touch sent a chill up her spine, but she ignored it. Taking a deep breath, she bent down, wrapped her arms around Eddie's heavy, unconscious body, and dragged him onto the plastic. His dead weight made her muscles strain, but adrenaline kept her going. She paused, standing over him, her heartbeat steady. There was no turning back now. Retrieving an extension cord, she plugged in the reciprocating saw. The hum of the blade sent vibrations through her hands as she positioned it just above Eddie's limp form. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing the trigger. The blade bit into flesh. Time blurred. The hours stretched long, but she worked methodically, pausing only occasionally to sip on her herbal tea. The irony of it wasn't lost on her, how something so violent could be interwoven with such a mundane ritual. But Elise felt no guilt, no hesitation. She was simply doing what had to be done. Piece by piece, she sealed Eddie away in freezer lock bags, placing them carefully into the chest freezer. The plastic she had laid down had served its purpose well, catching any stray mess. Even that, she neatly folded and packed away with him. She was almost amused at how little cleanup was required. By the time she was finished, exhaustion pressed against her limbs, but a dark satisfaction settled within her. Eddie, and his endless prying questions, were no longer a problem. But now came the second part. At first, she hadn't thought beyond his death, but as she worked, a plan had slowly taken shape. She stripped Eddie's body, dressing herself in his clothes. They were slightly loose but passable. Slipping on gloves, she took his keys, then moved to the mirror. With steady hands, she grabbed the clippers and shaved an undercut, the loose strands of her hair falling into the sink. She tied the rest up into a tight bun. Then, using black shoe polish, she darkened the exposed buzzed area, making her head appear flatter, more masculine. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Sliding into Eddie's car, she drove toward the beach. At every security camera she passed, She made sure to slightly speed up and lower her head, obscuring her face. No one would be able to clearly identify her. Once she arrived, she parked near the public restrooms and stepped inside. She changed quickly, stuffing Eddie's clothes into a duffel bag. The detective's keys and belongings were left in the car, deliberately, as if he had simply walked away. When she exited the restrooms, she didn't look back. She walked calmly to the bus stop, boarded a bus home, and disappeared into the city. Eddie was officially missing. And Elise? Elise would always remain one step ahead. Remember to like, subscribe, and share to others, so you don't miss an episode.